A night that changed everything. The cool evening air kissed Jessica Carter's skin as she pushed through the heavy double doors of St. Augustine Medical Center. The exhaustion from her 12-hour shift pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible weight, making each step toward the parking lot feel like trudging through quicksand. She rolled her neck, wincing at the stiffness, and reached into her purse for her car keys. All she wanted was a long, hot shower and a quiet evening with a book before another grueling shift tomorrow. Then she heard it. A faint groan. Jessica paused, her body tensing as her eyes swept the dimly lit alley between the hospital and the parking structure. A shadowed figure lay crumpled against the brick wall, barely visible in the darkness. Her instincts as a nurse kicked in before her exhaustion could convince her to walk away. "Sir," she called, stepping cautiously forward. "Are you okay?" No response. She approached, her heart picking up speed. As she drew closer, the dim glow from a nearby street lamp illuminated the man's frail form. His clothes were tattered and dirty, his skin pale and drawn, and his face was hidden beneath a scruffy, unkempt beard. Jessica knelt beside him, her fingers pressing gently against his wrist. His pulse was weak but steady. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, revealing a pair of bloodshot brown eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out a water bottle. "Here," she said gently, unscrewing the cap and pressing it to his lips. Small sips. He took the water greedily, coughing as he swallowed. After a few moments, he rasped, "Thank you." Jessica studied him carefully. His gaunt face was marked with years of hardship. His hands were trembling, fingers lined with deep calluses, and his nails were chipped and dirty. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, his gaze darting away as if afraid to answer. "Tom," he finally whispered. Jessica smiled softly. "I'm Jessica. I'm a nurse here. You have a nasty wound on your leg. I need to take a look." She reached for his pant leg, but he flinched. "No hospital," he croaked, shaking his head violently. "Can't afford it." Jessica's heart clenched. She'd heard that too many times before. "Don't worry about that right now," she reassured him. "Let me help, okay?" Reluctantly, Tom gave a small nod. Jessica carefully peeled back the dirty, blood-soaked rag wrapped around his leg. Her breath caught at the sight of the deep gash running along his calf. The wound was inflamed, red, and oozing pus. "You need antibiotics," she said, already reaching for her phone. "This could turn into a serious infection." "No." Tom's grip on her wrist was surprisingly strong for someone so weak. "Please, no hospital." Jessica frowned. His fear was palpable, his desperation clear. Something wasn't right. Still, she couldn't just leave him here to suffer. "Okay," she said slowly. "At least let me clean it properly." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small first aid kit she always carried. Working quickly but gently, she disinfected the wound, ignoring Tom's quiet hisses of pain. "You've been living on the streets for a while, haven't you?" she asked, her tone soft. Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at his hands, his fingers tightening into fists. "A long time," he finally muttered. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. She'd seen plenty of homeless patients come through the hospital, each with a story of hardship, loss, or misfortune. She always did her best to treat them with dignity, but something about Tom unsettled her. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, a look of familiarity she couldn't place. When she finished bandaging his leg, she sat back on her heels. "You should really come inside," she said, "even if just for a warm meal and a place to rest." Tom shook his head, panic flashing across his face. "I can't. I can't." Jessica sighed. "At least let me call someone." "No." Tom's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "No police. No shelters." Jessica stared at him. Fear rolled off of him in waves, as if the very thought of being found terrified him. She hesitated. A million questions swirled in her mind, but before she could ask them, Tom groaned, his body swaying. "Hey," Jessica said, reaching for him. "You okay?" "I don't feel so good." His eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. Jessica barely caught him before he collapsed completely. Panic surged through her veins. "Help!" She shouted toward the emergency entrance. A few moments later, 2 hospital orderlies rushed out with a gurney. "He collapsed," Jessica explained, her voice shaky. "Severe dehydration. Possible infection. We need fluids and antibiotics now." Tom's body was lifted onto the gurney, his head lolling to the side. Jessica followed as the team rushed him inside, her heart pounding. Why was he so afraid? And why did she feel as though she'd seen him before? As they wheeled him down the hall, Jessica glanced at his face again. She still couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was familiar. But it wasn't until later that night, when she returned to check on him, that she saw the tattoo. A small anchor, twisted with rope. Her blood ran cold. Jessica stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had seen that tattoo before, on an arm that used to hold her close, on a man who had disappeared from her life over 2 decades ago. A man she had spent years hating. A man she had once called Dad. Her whisper trembled in the quiet hospital room. But Tom didn't stir. Jessica gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. A part of her wanted to run, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But another part, the part that had spent years wondering why, needed answers. Her world tilted on its axis as she realized the truth. The homeless man she had just saved was the same man who had walked out of her life 20 years ago. And now he was back. But why? And why did he look so terrified? Jessica wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Yet, she knew she had no choice. The past had come knocking, and she was about to open the door. The weight of the past. Jessica sat frozen beside the hospital bed, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And yet the evidence was inked onto his skin. The same small anchor with a rope twisted around it. A symbol she hadn't seen in over 20 years. A symbol that had belonged to the father who abandoned her. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the tattoo, barely grazing the inked skin before pulling back as if burned. Her father. Here. Now. Lying weak and frail in a hospital bed, his once strong frame reduced to a gaunt shadow of the man she had clung to as a child. Jessica clenched her fists. Her nails bit into her palm, grounding her against the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. How dare he? How dare he show up now, after all these years, after leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves? Anger surged through her veins, burning hotter than she expected. She had spent her entire life wondering why he had left. She had begged for answers, cried herself to sleep at night, convinced she wasn't enough for him to stay. And now he was here, weak, helpless, utterly unrecognizable from the man who had once hoisted her onto his shoulders and called her his little princess. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut. She should walk away. She should leave him to whatever fate the universe had planned for him. But she couldn't. Not yet. Because as much as she wanted to hate him, as much as she wanted to shove every ounce of pain he caused back into his face, she needed to know why. Why did he leave? Why did he never come back? Why had she just found him on the streets, homeless, half dead, and terrified of being discovered? Her gaze flickered to the monitors. His heartbeat was steady, his oxygen levels normal. The IV dripped fluids into his system, slowly replenishing what he had lost from dehydration. Jessica exhaled shakily. She should wait for him to wake up, confront him, demand answers. But the thought of seeing his eyes open, of hearing his voice after all these years, sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She needed air. Without another glance at the sleeping man, Jessica shoved back her chair and strode toward the door. But before she could leave, a voice called out softly behind her, "Jessica." Her entire body locked in place. Slowly, painfully slowly, she turned around. Her breath hitched. Tom's eyes were open, hazy with confusion, but unmistakably locked onto her. She knew that look. She knew it. It was the same way he used to look at her when she was little, when she would curl up beside him on the couch, asking him to tell her bedtime stories just a little longer. Her heart thundered in her chest. She should say something. She should scream at him, demand to know where he had been all these years. But her throat felt like it was closing. "Do you know who I am?" she finally managed to whisper. Tom's brows knitted together in confusion, his lips parting as if to answer, then closing again. His gaze searched her face, his brown eyes clouded with uncertainty, before something flickered in his expression. Realization. Recognition. A sharp inhale. "Oh God." His voice cracked. His entire body tensed, as if the weight of his sins had just come crashing down on him all at once. Jessica felt her own chest tighten as she watched the emotions flicker across his face. Shock. Pain. And worst of all, guilt. "Jessica." His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His lips trembled as though he couldn't bring himself to say more. She clenched her fists at her sides. He remembered her, and yet for 20 years he had never once come back. "Don't," she snapped, her voice colder than she had intended. Tom flinched. "Don't say my name like that," she continued, bitterness coating every syllable. "Like I'm some long-lost treasure you just happened to stumble upon." Tom swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Jessica took a step closer, her jaw tightening. "You left," she spat. "You disappeared. You let Mom and me think you were dead. And now, after all this time, I find you half dead outside a hospital." Tom's breathing grew shaky, his fingers curling around the blanket on his lap. I can explain," he choked out. Jessica let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, can you? Well, by all means. Explain." Tom looked away, shame written across every line of his face. Jessica waited and waited, but he said nothing. Typical. Her chest ached with the weight of her disappointment. "I should have known," she muttered, shaking her head. "You ran from us then, and you're running from the truth now." She turned on her heel, marching toward the door. But before she could leave, his voice, weak, barely above a whisper, stopped her in her tracks. "I did it to protect you." Jessica froze. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob as she slowly turned to face him again. Tom's eyes met hers, haunted, pleading. "I had to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "If I stayed, they would have killed you and your mother." Jessica's heart stuttered. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "What?" she whispered. Tom swallowed, his fingers trembling as he clutched the blanket. "There were people," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Bad people. I got involved with something I shouldn't have, not by choice, but by accident. I uncovered something at work, something dangerous, and when I tried to do the right thing..." His voice broke. Jessica's breath shallowed. Tom let out a shaky exhale. "They told me if I didn't disappear, they'd come after you and your mother. I had no choice." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Jessica's mind reeled. She wanted to call him a liar. She wanted to believe he was just making excuses. But the way his voice trembled, the sheer fear in his eyes, something in her gut told her this wasn't a lie. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears. The father she had spent her entire life hating, the man she had convinced herself had simply abandoned them, was telling her he left to protect them. And suddenly, the past wasn't so black and white anymore. Her vision blurred as 1,000 emotions crashed into her all at once. Pain, anger, grief, and underneath it all, the smallest flicker of something else, something she had long since buried beneath the years of resentment. Hope. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, in 20 years. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hate him anymore. Shadows of the past. Jessica sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles under the dim glow of the streetlights. The quiet hum of the night should have been comforting, but her mind was anything but at peace. Her father was alive. For 20 years, she had believed he was either dead or worse, had simply abandoned them without a second thought. She had lived with that anger, let it define her, let it push her to work harder, to prove to herself that she was strong enough to survive without him. And now he was back, looking weak and broken, telling her that he had left to protect them. Jessica's hands trembled as she exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. It had to be a lie, didn't it? She had spent years building a wall between herself and the pain he had caused, letting herself believe that he had left for a reason, that he had been forced to go, felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. And yet, the way he had looked at her, the fear in his eyes, the tremor in his voice, something about it felt real. Jessica shut her eyes, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for her mother. Lydia Carter had been the strongest woman Jessica had ever known. She had raised her daughter alone, worked herself to the bone to provide for their small family, and never once let Jessica see just how much she was suffering. Jessica knew that her mother had cried when she thought no one was watching. She knew that Lydia had spent sleepless nights at the kitchen table, staring at the front door, waiting for a man who never returned. Jessica's jaw tightened. How could she tell her mother that the man who had abandoned them was still alive? How could she not? Her fingers hovered over the ignition, but before she could turn the key, her phone buzzed against the dashboard. She grabbed it, her pulse spiking when she saw Maria's name flash across the screen. Maria was one of her closest friends at the hospital, a fellow nurse who had been with her through some of her hardest shifts. If anyone could help her make sense of this mess, it was her. With a deep breath, Jessica answered. "Jess." Maria's voice came through the speaker, laced with concern. "Are you okay? You left in a hurry earlier." Jessica hesitated. I don't know." "What happened?" Jessica closed her eyes. She hadn't told Maria yet, not the whole truth. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "The homeless man I brought in tonight. He's my father." Silence. Then, "Wait. What?" Jessica's throat felt tight as she spoke. "It's him, Maria. I recognize the tattoo on his arm. It's the same one he had when I was a kid." Jesus. Maria's voice was quiet, as if she was trying to process the shock herself. "I don't even know what to say. What did he tell you?" Jessica hesitated before repeating her father's words. About the danger, the threats, the reason he left. She expected Maria to scoff, to call it a pathetic excuse. But instead, her friend was silent for a long moment. "Do you believe him?" Maria finally asked. Jessica opened her mouth, then shut it again. "Did she?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to, but I don't know if I can." Maria sighed. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. But Jess, if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, don't you think you should find out for sure?" Jessica's stomach twisted. She had spent years hating him. She wasn't sure she was ready to let that go. And yet, Maria was right. If there was even a chance that he was telling the truth, she needed to know. "I think I need to talk to my mom first," Jessica murmured. "Yeah," Maria agreed. "She deserves to know." Jessica exhaled slowly. "Thanks, Maria." "Anytime, Jess. And hey, whatever happens, you don't have to go through it alone." Jessica smiled faintly. "I know." After hanging up, she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty parking lot. Then, with a deep breath, she turned the key in the ignition and drove home. A mother's pain. Lydia Carter sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The house was quiet, too quiet. She had never quite gotten used to the silence after Jessica moved out. Even though they still saw each other often, the house had always felt emptier without the sound of her daughter's footsteps, the soft hum of music drifting from her bedroom, the warmth of her presence filling every corner. She had done everything she could to give Jessica a good life, to make sure she never felt alone. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always something missing, a hole that Lydia could never quite fill. She exhaled softly, staring down at the tea swirling in her cup. Then the front door creaked open. Lydia looked up as Jessica stepped inside, her expression tense. Something was wrong. "Jessica?" Lydia set her cup down. "Sweetheart, what's the matter?" Jessica hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. Then, "Mom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. And it's going to be hard to hear." Lydia's heart clenched. She hadn't heard that tone in her daughter's voice since she was a child, since the night Jessica had asked, in a tiny broken voice, "Why isn't Daddy coming back?" Lydia swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "Sit down, honey. Tell me." Jessica hesitated before pulling out a chair across from her. She took a deep breath, as if steadying herself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I found Dad." The world tilted. Lydia's hands clenched against the table. "What?" Jessica's throat bobbed. "I found him, Mom. At the hospital. He was homeless. He collapsed outside the ER." Lydia felt like she had been punched in the chest. "Tom. After all these years. After everything." "He's alive," she whispered. Jessica nodded, biting her lip. Lydia gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she could barely hear her own thoughts. It didn't make sense. After 20 years, after countless nights spent crying herself to sleep, wondering if he was dead, he was alive, living on the streets. And Jessica had found him. Her entire body trembled. "I don't." Her voice cracked. "I don't understand. Why now? Why?" Jessica looked down, as if struggling to find the right words. "He told me." She hesitated. "He told me he didn't leave because he wanted to. He said he was protecting us." Lydia let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "Protecting us?" she echoed. Jessica nodded. "He said there were people after him. Dangerous people. He left to keep us safe." Lydia's stomach twisted. Tom had always been good at making excuses. She had believed him once. But now she wasn't sure if she could ever believe him again. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as she met her daughter's gaze. "What do you want to do, Jessica?" Jessica's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, Lydia saw something in her daughter's eyes she had never expected. Doubt. Because Jessica wasn't sure if she hated him anymore. And that terrified Lydia more than anything. The ghosts we bury. Lydia Carter had never considered herself weak. She had endured heartbreak, abandonment, and the crushing weight of single motherhood. She had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over her daughter's head, had sacrificed everything to make sure Jessica never felt the gaping hole left by a man who had walked away without a second glance. And yet, here she was, standing in her kitchen, feeling like the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. Tom was alive. For 20 years, she had convinced herself he was dead. She had allowed herself to imagine 1,000 different endings to their story, some tragic, some pathetic, but all final. But he wasn't dead. He was homeless, broken, and worst of all, Jessica had found him. Lydia's fingers curled into fists, her nails pressing hard into her palms. She could see it now, the uncertainty in Jessica's eyes, the hesitation in her voice. Her daughter was considering something she shouldn't. Forgiveness. Lydia's stomach twisted at the thought. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that what Tom had done was unforgivable. So why, now, did the very idea of him being alive shake her so violently? She swallowed, forcing herself to meet Jessica's gaze. "Are you sure?" Her voice was quiet, almost hollow. "Are you sure it's him?" Jessica nodded slowly. "He has the tattoo, Mom. The anchor with the rope. The same one he had before he—" She stopped short, her throat working against the words. "Before he left." Lydia felt something in her chest tighten. Of course it was him. She had memorized every detail of that man, no matter how hard she had tried to forget. The way his hands had always been warm when they held hers. The way he used to hum old Motown songs under his breath while making breakfast. The way his laughter had once filled their home like sunlight spilling through the curtains on a Sunday morning. And then, the way he had disappeared. The way he had left them with nothing. Her throat burned as she forced herself to sit down. She gripped the edge of the table, grounding herself. Jessica watched her carefully, almost nervously. Lydia exhaled slowly. "And what did he say?" Jessica hesitated. Then softly, "He said he left to protect us." Lydia scoffed. "Protect us?" Jessica nodded. Lydia's stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to laugh, to rage, at the absurdity of it. For years, she had envisioned the moment she would see Tom again. In some versions of the fantasy, she slapped him. In others, she screamed until her voice was raw. In all of them, she demanded the truth. And now, after 2 decades, that truth was finally in front of her. But it wasn't what she had expected. "What else did he say?" Lydia asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Jessica swallowed. That there were dangerous people. That he was involved in something he shouldn't have been. That if he stayed, they would have come after us. Lydia's blood ran cold. She had always assumed Tom had left because he wanted to. That he had walked away because responsibility was too heavy. But if what he was saying was true, if he had left because there were actual threats, why hadn't he told her? Why had he disappeared completely? And why, after all these years, was he still too afraid to come home? Lydia pressed her fingers against her temples. "Jessica, do you believe him?" Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "I don't know." Lydia exhaled sharply. "Do you want to see him again?" Jessica's hesitation was answer enough. Lydia clenched her jaw. She didn't want Tom in their lives. Not after the damage he had caused. But Jessica needed answers, and Lydia wasn't sure she could stop her from chasing them. "Mom," Jessica said carefully, "I think I need to talk to him again. I think we both do." Lydia's breath hitched. "No," she said immediately. Jessica flinched. "Mom." "No," Lydia repeated, her voice steel. "I can't. I won't." Jessica's expression crumpled. "Why?" "Because I spent 20 years trying to move on, Jessica." Lydia snapped, her voice cracking. "I buried him. I forced myself to stop wondering if he was alive, if he missed us, if he ever thought about what he left behind." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I won't open that door again." Silence fell between them. Jessica's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. Something that might break Lydia's resolve. But Lydia stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. She turned away, her chest heaving. "If you want to see him," Lydia said quietly, "I won't stop you." Jessica let out a shaky breath. "Mom." "But I can't." Lydia's voice wavered. "I just can't." Without another word, Lydia walked out of the kitchen. She didn't stop until she was in her bedroom, where she shut the door and pressed her back against it. Then, finally, the tears she had been holding back spilled over. The man who was once her father. Jessica stood outside her father's hospital room, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind. "I won't open that door again." But Jessica had to. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, just maybe, there was still a small part of her that wanted to believe him. She inhaled sharply, then pushed open the door. Tom was awake. His eyes flickered toward her immediately, his face unreadable. Jessica stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, "You came back." Jessica's jaw tightened. "I need answers." Tom swallowed. "I know." She crossed her arms. "Tell me everything." Tom looked away. "Jessica, No more half-truths," she interrupted. "No more vague explanations. If you really left to protect us, I need to know why." Tom exhaled shakily. "It's not safe." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "For who?" Tom's fingers curled into the hospital blanket. "For you, for your mother, and for me." Jessica's stomach twisted. "What are you afraid of?" Tom hesitated, then slowly lifted his gaze to hers. And for the first time, Jessica saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not just guilt, not just regret, but pure, unfiltered fear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're still looking for me." Jessica's breath hitched. Tom swallowed hard. "The people who wanted me dead 20 years ago. They never stopped looking." Jessica's blood ran cold. The past wasn't just a memory. It was a threat, and it had just found its way back into their lives. A truth buried in shadows. Jessica's entire body went rigid. "They're still looking for me." Her father's words echoed in her mind, twisting and turning like a storm she couldn't control. For a long, suffocating moment, the hospital room felt too small, too quiet, as if the walls were closing in around her. She had spent 20 years believing Tom Witter was gone. Now, not only was he alive, he was running. From something. From someone. And if what he said was true, they might still be looking for her and her mother, too. Jessica swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom hesitated. Then, "I don't know if I should tell you." Jessica's patience snapped. "You don't get to decide what I should or shouldn't know," she said sharply. "Not anymore." Tom flinched, shame flickering across his gaunt face. Jessica exhaled, forcing herself to push past the anger. "If you really left to protect us, then tell me what you were running from." Tom hesitated. Then, slowly, he leaned back against the pillows, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "I worked in accounting," he began, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't anyone important, just a guy crunching numbers, handling payroll. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills." Jessica frowned. That much, she remembered. Her father had worked at a financial firm, some mid-level company she had never cared to ask much about as a kid. But now, for the first time, she wondered, what kind of company was it? Tom exhaled slowly. "One day, I noticed something in the reports. Money was going missing. Large amounts. At first, I thought it was just an error, a glitch in the system. But when I started looking deeper, I realized it wasn't a mistake." Jessica's stomach twisted. She had seen enough in her years at the hospital to recognize when someone was leading up to something big, something dark. Tom's fingers trembled as he clenched the blanket in his lap. "I found transactions, payments being rerouted to offshore accounts. Hidden, laundered money. Someone was moving it, shifting it in ways that didn't make sense. When I tried to report it to my supervisor, he told me to drop it." Jessica felt a cold chill run down her spine. Tom let out a humorless chuckle. "I should have listened. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I kept digging. And when I found out where the money was going, that's when everything fell apart." Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears. Where was it going? Tom's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward the hospital door, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Then, private accounts, shell corporations, a few overseas businesses that didn't exist on paper. He swallowed hard. But it wasn't just financial fraud. The people behind it, they weren't just businessmen. Jessica's breath hitched. Who were they? Tom's voice lowered to a whisper. "The kind of men who don't like being washed. Jessica's heart stuttered. She didn't need him to spell it out. Whoever these people were, whoever he had gotten involved with, they weren't just criminals. They were dangerous. Lethal. Tom rubbed his hands over his face, his fingers shaking. I didn't understand the scope of it at first. I thought I was just dealing with white-collar criminals, guys skimming money off the top. But when I started looking deeper, I found names. People with government connections. Officials. Law enforcement. Jessica's breath came faster. Corruption. Her father had stumbled onto something big. Bigger than she had ever imagined. Tom swallowed hard. I made one last mistake. I tried to report it again. I went to someone higher up. Someone I thought I could trust. But he wasn't clean either. By the time I realized how deep it went, it was too late. Jessica clenched her fists. What happened? Tom's voice grew hollow. I got a warning. Not subtle, not vague. A direct warning. A man showed up at my house that night. He didn't threaten me. He didn't need to. Tom's eyes darkened. He told me I had a family, a wife, a daughter, and if I wanted to keep them safe, I'd disappear. Jessica felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. She tried to speak, but her throat had closed up. Tom exhaled sharply. I knew they weren't bluffing. I knew what would happen if I didn't listen. His voice cracked. So I ran. Jessica's hands were trembling. Why didn't you tell us? Tom's expression twisted with pain. Because I couldn't risk it. If I stayed, they would have used you both to get to me. He shook his head. I thought if I disappeared, they'd let you go. That you'd be safe. Jessica wanted to scream. Instead, she whispered, and were we? Tom didn't answer. Jessica clenched her jaw, trying to breathe past the rage surging through her. For 20 years, she had thought he had left because he chose to. And now she was being told that he had left to save them. But at what cost? Jessica exhaled sharply. Do you really think they're still looking for you? Tom hesitated. Then softly. They never stopped. Jessica's chest tightened. Tom swallowed hard. I never stayed in one place too long. I never used my real name. But sometimes I saw them. His hands clenched into fists. A face I recognized on the street. A car parked outside too long. I don't know if they want me dead, or if they're just making sure I stay gone. Jessica's stomach churned. And now you're here. Tom met her gaze, and I don't know if that's a good thing. Silence stretched between them. Jessica's mind raced. If these people were still watching, had they seen her bring Tom into the hospital? Did they know who she was? Her pulse quickened. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what to do. But first, she needed to tell her mother. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Tom's expression flickered with worry. Jessica. She didn't look at him. I need to go. Jessica. I need to go. Without another word, she turned and walked out the door. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed to warn her mother. But before she could dial, she noticed something. A black car, parked across the street from the hospital. Motionless. Engine off. But inside, 2 figures sat. Watching. Jessica's blood ran cold. The past wasn't just a memory. It was here. And it was watching. The watchers in the dark. Jessica's breath came fast and shallow as she stood frozen outside the hospital, her phone still clutched in her trembling fingers. The black car remained parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. But they weren't just parked there. They were watching. Her father. Her entire world tilted. Jessica had spent years believing the past was behind her, buried beneath her mother's hard work, her own struggles, and the life they had built from the ashes of abandonment. But now the past was staring straight at her. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. Who were they? Were they just watching? Or were they waiting for something? For her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She needed to get out of here. But first, she had to make sure they weren't following her. Jessica forced herself to move casually toward her car, every muscle in her body screaming to run. She fought the urge to look over her shoulder, to make it obvious that she had seen them. With a quick glance, she noted the position of the vehicle, still idling in the same spot. Waiting. She slid into the driver's seat and pulled out of the parking lot, forcing herself to keep her hands steady on the wheel. Her pulse roared in her ears as she checked the rearview mirror. For a few agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, the black car's headlights flicked on. Jessica's grip tightened around the steering wheel. They're following me. A cold sweat broke out along her spine. She pressed the gas pedal harder, weaving through the streets of the city, trying to lose them. But every turn she took, every side street, every sudden lane change, they followed. Not too close, not aggressive, but present, watching. Jessica swallowed the rising panic in her throat. She needed to get home. She needed to warn her mother. Without thinking, she pressed down on the accelerator, making a sharp right toward her neighborhood. She just had to make it home. She just had to. The black car suddenly slowed down. Jessica's breath hitched. It lingered at an intersection, waiting, then turned down a different road. They weren't following her anymore. They had let her go. But why? That was almost worse. Jessica's stomach churned with unease as she finally pulled into her driveway. She shut the car off and took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. If they weren't following her anymore, were they watching someone else? She scrambled out of the car and rushed up the front steps. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door, pushing it open. "Mom," she called. No answer. Jessica's heart slammed against her ribs as she stepped inside, scanning the living room. Her mother's purse sat on the entry table, meaning she was home. "Mom," she called again, her voice cracking. This time, she heard movement. A moment later, Lydia stepped into the room, her brow furrowed. "Jessica, what's wrong?" Jessica nearly collapsed with relief. But then, she remembered why she was here. Her mother was still standing in the doorway, confused and waiting for an explanation. Jessica clenched her fists. There was no easy way to say this. She had to tell her everything. The hardest truth. Lydia sat stiffly on the couch, her expression unreadable. Jessica had just told her everything. Every word her father had spoken. Every fear he had whispered. The truth about why he left. The warning he had received. The people still looking for him. And finally, the black car outside the hospital. Lydia's fingers curled around the fabric of her jeans, her knuckles white. Jessica braced herself for something, a reaction, a scream, anything. But her mother didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just sat there, completely silent. Then, finally, Lydia let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Jessica's stomach turned. "Mom." 20 years, Lydia said quietly, shaking her head. 20 years of anger. Of telling myself that he was just a coward. That he left because he didn't love us. Jessica's chest ached at the rawness in her mother's voice. Lydia exhaled sharply. "And now you're telling me. He did love us." She let out another sharp, humorless laugh. That he was trying to protect us. Jessica swallowed hard. "Mom, I know it's a lot." Lydia turned sharply to face her. "And you believe him?" Jessica hesitated. Did she? A week ago, she would have sworn she hated him. Now she didn't know what to feel. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I saw him, Mom. He's not lying. I don't think he can." Lydia's throat bobbed. Then softly, "And what if it's true?" Jessica blinked. Lydia exhaled slowly, rubbing her forehead. "What if he was protecting us?" She clenched her jaw. "What if I spent 20 years hating the wrong person?" Jessica's heart ached. She didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. Silence stretched between them for a long moment before Lydia finally stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed out her shirt. Then, "Take me to him." Jessica's breath hitched. "What?" Lydia's voice was quiet but steady. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to hear it from him." Jessica hesitated. Her mother had sworn that she would never open that door again. And now, she was willing to step through it. Jessica exhaled shakily, then nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Without another word, Lydia grabbed her coat. And together, they left. An unfinished goodbye. Tom Witter had never been more afraid in his life. Not even when he had received the warning all those years ago. Not even when he had first disappeared, leaving behind his wife and daughter, knowing he would never see them again. Because now he had seen them again, and they knew everything. His hands trembled slightly as he sat in the hospital bed, staring out the window. He had told Jessica the truth. But would Lydia believe it? Would she even want to see him? He wasn't sure if he was strong enough for this. The door suddenly creaked open. Tom tensed, his pulse quickening. And then, he saw her. Lydia. His breath caught in his throat. She looked older, tired, beautiful. Her expression was unreadable as she stepped inside, Jessica following behind her. Tom swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the hospital blanket. "Lydia," he whispered. She stared at him for a long moment, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Then, very, very quietly, "How dare you?" Tom felt his heart shatter. Lydia's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer, her hands trembling. "How dare you show up now?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything. After 20 years. Tom opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lydia's breath hitched. Then, finally, she asked the one question that had haunted her for 2 decades. "Did you ever plan to come back?" Tom's chest ached. His throat tightened. He had told himself for years that it was impossible, that he couldn't. But now, face to face with the woman he had never stopped loving, his voice cracked. "I wanted to." A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek. Jessica watched, silent, and Tom realized. This wasn't just an introduction. This was a reckoning, and there was still so much left unsaid. The price of the past. The hospital room was thick with silence. Lydia stood near the doorway, her body rigid, her arms crossed as if bracing herself against a storm. Jessica stood just behind her mother, her own hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart pounding as she watched the tension crackle between her parents. And Tom Witter, the man who had disappeared for 20 years, sat on the hospital bed, his shoulders slumped, his face lined with exhaustion and regret. The weight of everything, years of pain, unanswered questions, unfinished goodbyes, hung between them like a rope, fraying with each second that passed. Lydia's voice was the first to break the silence. "You wanted to come back," she whispered, her voice raw. Tom swallowed hard, his gaze locked onto the floor. Don't lie to me." Lydia's voice wavered, but her eyes were sharp, filled with something dangerous. Jessica had never seen her mother like this before. Tom exhaled shakily. "I wanted to," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't." Lydia let out a bitter laugh. "Couldn't or wouldn't?" Tom's hands clenched into fists. "I couldn't risk it." "Risk what?" Lydia snapped. "Risk being a father. Risk facing the mess you made." Tom looked up, his eyes glassy with unused tears. "Risk getting you both killed." Lydia flinched. Jessica held her breath. Tom ran a trembling hand over his face. "Lydia, I know you hate me. You have every right to. But I swear to you, I left because I had to. Not because I wanted to." Lydia's lip trembled. "You should have told me," she whispered. Tom closed his eyes. I thought about it. Every day, I thought about it. But the more time passed, the harder it got. If I came back, I would have put a target on your backs. Lydia shook her head, her jaw tightening. And what exactly were we supposed to do in the meantime, Tom? Her voice cracked. Do you have any idea what it was like? Raising Jessica alone. Working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Tom's face twisted in pain. I do. No, you don't. Lydia's voice broke. You weren't there. Tom flinched, and Jessica felt something in her chest tighten. Lydia's hands trembled as she wiped away a stray tear. I needed you, Tom. And you weren't there. Jessica needed you, and you weren't there. Tom swallowed hard. I know. Lydia exhaled sharply, as if the weight of her own anger was crushing her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Jessica finally stepped forward. Dad, she said softly. The words still felt foreign on her tongue, like something she wasn't sure she had the right to say. Tom's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Jessica swallowed. There's something I need to ask you. Tom nodded slowly. Anything. Jessica inhaled deeply, then locked eyes with him. Are they still watching us? Tom's face paled. His fingers curled into the hospital blanket, his breath coming faster. Then, quietly, yes. Jessica's pulse quickened. Lydia stiffened beside her. They never stopped, Tom admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They kept tabs on me. Sometimes, I'd see them. Other times, I could feel them watching. He exhaled sharply. I thought they would let it go after 20 years, but now that I've resurfaced. His gaze flickered to Jessica. You found me, he whispered. And if they know that. Lydia's breath hitched. Then we're in danger. Tom nodded slowly. Jessica clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about now. About the future. Jessica glanced at her mother. Mom, we need to go. We can't stay here. Lydia's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. You're right. Jessica turned back to Tom. Dad, can you walk? Tom hesitated, then shifted, swinging his legs off the bed. He winced slightly, but when he stood, he was steady. I can manage. Jessica nodded. Then we need to leave. Now. Lydia shot her a sharp look. Where are we going? Jessica's mind raced. They couldn't go home. They couldn't stay at the hospital. For now, they needed somewhere safe. A place where they could figure out their next move. Jessica exhaled. Maria's place, she said finally. Lydia frowned. Your friend from the hospital. She'll help us, Jessica said. She won't ask questions. She's got a spare room, and no one would think to look for us there. Lydia hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, she said. Let's go. The hunt begins. The night air was thick with tension as Jessica helped Tom into the backseat of her car. Her hands were shaking. Her entire body was on high alert. She scanned the parking lot, searching for the black car she had seen earlier. Nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't out there. Watching. Waiting. Jessica slid into the driver's seat, Lydia climbing into the passenger side. She turned the key in the ignition, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then, she pulled out of the parking lot. Tom exhaled shakily in the back seat. Jessica gripped the wheel tighter. Every streetlight, every passing car, every shadow in the distance sent a chill down her spine. Were they being followed? She checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. But she didn't trust it. Not anymore. She pressed the gas pedal, weaving through the streets, her pulse pounding. They drove in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Then, Lydia spoke. Tom, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Tom lifted his head. Yeah. Lydia's fingers curled in her lap. If we survive this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what happens next? Tom swallowed hard. I don't know, he admitted. Lydia nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. Then softly, I don't know if I can forgive you. Tom inhaled sharply. Jessica's chest ached at the rawness in her mother's voice. But, Lydia continued, her voice trembling, I want to try. Tom's breath hitched. Jessica tightened her grip on the wheel. None of this was easy. None of this could be undone. But maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to heal, to move forward, to be something. Jessica checked the mirror again. Still no sign of the black car. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As the city lights flickered past, she whispered a silent prayer. Because whatever was coming next, they had to be ready. The past was no longer just chasing them. It had finally caught up. And it was only a matter of time before it demanded its due.